He is not here. He has been raised. This is where the story ends, actually. Mark's Gospel, the first one to be written by people who are at best second or third generation Jesus followers, end the story there. He is not here. He has been raised. And they were so afraid, they didn't go and tell anyone. And it just ends. The conclusion's left up to you. If you read more of the New Testament, you will find bodily resurrection appearances. Jesus appearing to his disciples on the beach and cooking fish. And Thomas putting his hand inside Jesus' wounds. All of it written years, decades, after the people who wrote Mark just ended it with, "He is risen, he is not here." All the theology about bodily resurrection and resurrection being the way Jesus saves everybody, not in there. There's no Frankenstein's monster Jesus. There's no Walking Dead Jesus. There's just an empty tomb, and he is not here. He is risen. Both true believers and skeptics fall into the trap of biblical literalism. Whether you take as an article of faith the events of Scripture happened just as described, or whether you dismiss them as too fantastical to be worthy of consideration, you miss the point. These were not written as literal history, these stories. And most of the time, they were written to be taken at other than face value. New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan reminds us, "My point, once again, is not that these ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically. They wrote them symbolically, and we are now so dumb that we take them literally." And thus, both sides of scriptural debate are equally obtuse, both the fundamentalist and the skeptic, because they both assume as a working proposition the stories literally happened just that way. One accepts it as an article of faith, and the other as beneath reasonable consideration, and thus miss the point. Miss the majority of the symbolism, the depth, the actual meaning that the writers and tellers of the story wanted us to understand. And we tend to do this as human beings, to take an event or an idea with deep meaning, depths, many facets and sides, and reduce it and oversimplify it so we can avoid the difficulties of wrestling with something that is not so neat and tidy and demands much more engagement from us. We have reduced Martin Luther King this way, to platitudes about diversity. And the resurrection has become, in the same fashion, the be-all, end-all of Jesus and Christianity. Martin Luther King gets wrapped up in a neat box of, well, there used to be slavery, and then there was a Civil War in Lincoln, and then Dr. King marched and had a dream, and now we all get along. And that's what our Martin Luther King's celebrations usually do. They don't dive into the depth of how radical he was, and the anti-war stance, and the anti-poverty stance, and all the other stuff. And the resurrection's the same thing. Easter has been wrapped up in a neat box that forgets the realities and complexities and symbolisms of the story. Jesus died, God brought him back to life. Now God likes us if we believe he brought Jesus back to life, and now let's have chocolate and Easter bunnies. Which skips over all the depth to be found in the story. So much of Christianity through the ages has been obsessed with this afterlife. Are we saved? Did Jesus' death and resurrection keep us from a horrible afterlife and not get us into a good one and all this stuff? But know that the Bible, by and large, does not care about the afterlife at all. Not a bit. the immortal soul and your afterlife destination is not a biblical concept. That all comes from Greek philosophy. The ancient Israelites had no beliefs, zero beliefs, no coherent systemic philosophy about the afterlife, none. Scour the oldest biblical writings and you will find nothing, because it's not there. You will find things like this, however. Psalm 39. Turn your gaze away from me, O God, that I might smile again before I depart and I am no more. Scholars think that the reason ancient Israel had a complete lack of philosophy or theology on the afterlife was to once again separate them and make them and their religion different from that of all their neighbors, all of whom had elaborate theories and theologies of the afterlife. For example, Egypt. Mummification, huge tombs full of all these supplies for the afterlife, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. You get this in all those ancient Near Eastern cultures, every single one, except ancient Israel, where there's nothing. Eventually, in the biblical literature, will pop up the concept of Sheol, the place of death. But it has no characteristics, it has no description, it's not good or bad, it's just the place of deadness and death. And even Sheol does not show up until after the Israelites had been Hellenized, after the contact with the Greeks, after the Greek conquest of the ancient Near East with Alexander the Great. All this is important to keep in mind when we wrestle with resurrection, death and dying, and what comes after, and what happened to Jesus. The first mention whatsoever of resurrection in Christian writing is in Paul's letter to the Galatians, written good 20 years after Jesus dies. And when he mentions it, what Paul is talking about is he doesn't see a bodily resurrected Jesus. He doesn't see Jesus at all. He sees a blinding flash of light. And the way he describes it is a revelation. And the meaning of the Greek word here is really important because it means insight. It means he had a flash of insight and understanding. And this meaning of his experience, and a lot of the term resurrection, has been twisted so much in the centuries afterwards. New Testament scholar Brandon Scott, in his book, The Problem with Resurrection, writes that there were a multiplicity of understandings of the term resurrection in the early Jesus communities. Eventually, one of these ideas, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, became the lens through which everything else in the Christian world was viewed. The early Christians, however, believed that Jesus' death at the hands of Rome could not stop his message. The early understanding of resurrection, the one that was most common in the earliest days, was that the message lived on even though the messenger has died. The word we translate resurrection as anastasis, and we translate this in English resurrection. But the Greek actually has a very everyday, run-of-the-mill meaning. It means to stand up, to get up. When the New Testament speaks of resurrection and to stand up and get up, it's spoken and used in very ordinary ways. For example, when you read in the Gospels at the Last Supper, Jesus got up from the table to wash his disciples' feet. We do not translate this, Jesus resurrected from the table and then washed his disciples' feet. But it's the same word used when the angel says, he is not here. He has gotten up. The terms get up, stand up are used in Hebrew to talk of the Jewish prophets and martyrs. those who stood up for their faith, who gave their lives for their religion. So the early Christians, being Jews, applied this martyr language to get up and stand up for the faith they had in Jesus. And instead of Hebrew, they wrote in Greek, because at the time Greek was the everyday world language of its time, the way English in many ways is today. If you're an educated person anywhere in the Greco-Roman world during the time of Jesus, you spoke Greek. Even the Romans spoke Greek. Right? So when the angel in Mark says, he is not here, he has stood up, he has gotten up, the original readers and hearers of this would have known exactly what was being referred to. This Jesus got up and stood up the way the prophets and the martyrs of Israel did. They would not have thought, oh wow, he's like bodily alive again. They would have heard and rightly thought that the writer was trying to tell them he has stood up and gotten up for the faith, as the prophets and martyrs of old. All the bodily resurrection appearances come way after this first story from Mark, which ends with, he is not here, he has gotten up. And so, all of that as a lead-up to say, I don't believe we are saved because Jesus stood up for his faith. I believe we are saved, we find salvation and help and healing and growth when we stand up for ours. For the things we put our faith and trust in, we stand up for that. That is what heals us, makes us whole, saves us. And the thing that always grabs me about the Easter story is not Easter. Jesus dies, and like all good prophets and martyrs of Israel, stands up. What grabs me after he is not here, he is risen, is that his followers stand up. His followers who are scared into silence, and rightly so. Your friend and leader gets crucified, you're going to think twice about saying anything in public, which is why they crucified people. It was very intimidating. So the followers are scared into silence, and they go into hiding, and then something happens that gets them to stand up. Months, maybe even years later, all of a sudden, this community is emboldened to stand up for their faith as well. To get up and represent the way of spirituality and ethics Jesus told them about. And all of a sudden, in standing up, they are now willing to take on the risk of being unjustly killed for doing so. So what happened to them? I don't know. I think they were saved. They were made a little more whole and a little more healthy, and thus a little more brave. Not by the faith of fairy tales and blind belief, but of the trust they put in the deep teaching and example they had from Jesus. The first followers of Jesus began to trust, have faith in, that Jesus' message did live on and stand up in and through them. They began to trust that the Romans could not kill this message. They began to trust the deep truths of the things they had learned. Feed the hungry, set the oppressed free, care for the sick, share to the point of foolishness with one another so that you can feed multitudes. Forgive to the point of foolishness with each other, 70 times, 7 times, so that you can repair relationships with one another. Turn the other cheek, not in meekness, but in the self-assured strength of standing up to unfair treatment and injustice. The deep truth that religious rules are useless if they do not foster wholeness and healing, so that it is indeed okay to heal someone on the Sabbath and hang out with Samaritans and everybody else we thought is not worthy. They began to trust in this message and to stand up for it. And in so doing, they let the standing renew and rejuvenate them. And they began to be bearers of the message. And this, I think, is a part of the saving story we so often miss. They did this as a community. We do not hear of all these isolated stories of one follower or another follower doing this all on their own. Like finally they got the courage to stand up too, one at a time. The picture we get in the later stories of the Pentecost is the flames of insight appearing to all of them as a group. They all got it. Yes, we have stories like Stephen, the first martyr, but I think we have his because he was the first who had to pay the price of what they were all doing. No one, this is why community is so important, no one can save another person. No one heals or makes whole another. We do that work ourselves, largely. But we cannot do it in isolation. It takes a community of which we are a part for us to realize our health and healing and wholeness. We need a loving community in which to grow and feel supported and cared for when we fall and fail. We need a group of people we can trust and feel safe among so we can travel the path of our salvation on the road to our own healing and wholeness. Ada Blue's Hopedale community understood this, that we need each other to stand up for our truth. It is that in community we live out the things in which we have trust or faith. A community that can rise and stand up together is always a work in progress. Aidan Ballou and his community knew that. The early Jesus communities knew that. Last week I was at the installation of Reverend Daniel Gregoire in Upton, and the preacher there told the congregation in Daniel that much of Paul's writing in the New Testament is not nice, gentle pastoral letters. It is a pastor writing very angry letters to a congregation to stop bickering with each other, to stop arguing over who has the best interpretation of their history and their Jesus story, to stop fighting over who's more holy and prays better than the other people. She reminded us that even that favorite passage of Paul that is read at all these weddings about love being patient and kind was not some flowery language Paul knew would someday be read at a wedding. It was him telling the Corinthian congregation that if you actually love each other, you will be kind and patient and bear through difficulty with each other. He told them that the most important thing about our message is trust. Faith that what we have to teach and how we live is valuable and real. The thing we have that's most important and central is the hope that gives us and the love with which we treat one another so we can be examples of all those teachings and messages we want to convey to others. What's not important is all that stuff you're fighting about. And we tend to get into all these fights, he tells them, because we don't want to focus on love and faith and hope. And it's been true of religious congregations ever since. We frequently get into all these little side fights because we don't want to do the hard work of living out our faith with each other and teaching it to the world around us. The early Christian communities experienced resurrection, standing up. They got knocked down, they stood up again. They had formed around a teacher they loved deeply, and they were thrown into disorder by his execution. They had to go through a period, and they're silent in it. And then we see them through Paul's letters fighting over it. They had to go through a period of disorder in order to reorder themselves. Franciscan friar Richard Rohr reminds us in his writing that we only do get to order through traveling through the disorder. And in our reading this morning, Niebuhr reminds us that we are saved, we are healed and made whole by these things the early Christian community so valued: faith, hope, and love. Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Nothing we do, however virtuous, is accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love, the things in which we trust. For these things we will rise and stand up. Through these things we will be made healthy and whole. Richard Rohr again writes, "It's no small thing finding spiritual healing, wholeness, because there's so much in our world that is ill and sick and troubled. It's no wonder we seek salvation, wholeness and healing, and find it hard to find. But we trust, we have faith that it is possible, with help from others, to get there." And thus we trust in this Easter story that reminds us of the importance of standing up for love with each other. I think it no accident that our Unitarian Universalism calls it standing on the side of love. And we trust the Easter story of rebirth, rejuvenation, and renewal. And together, as a community, we rise. Happy Easter. He is not here. He has risen. He has stood up. And so can we.